Hi. A couple of weeks ago, I released an album on the YouTube audio library, as well as on Bandcamp and other streaming services, and all the tracks on that album were a result of a jam or a performance, meaning sitting down and playing something, admittedly with some editing tricks and a little mastering polish, but still in contrast to meticulously refining song bits on a DAW's timeline. Now, God forbid I'm not saying anything against creating a track bit by bit on a timeline, and as you'll see I cheated a little bit with a DAW, but rather that there's no reason why a jam or short performance can't be track-worthy, especially if you spice it up a little. In this video, I'll share some tips and ideas that I learned along the way in hopes that you'll find them useful. Let's get started. The first tip is a technical one. Always check for noise before you record and always leave headroom. Double check with headphones or good monitors that there are no unwanted ground loops or other unwanted noise in your recording. If you do hear noise, I made a whole video about avoiding ground loops and taking care of them in post if you missed them, and linked to it below. And regarding headroom, make sure that the loudest you play your instruments combined will never peak or distort. I try and set it so my peaks never go above -12 dB. It's always much easier to increase levels later on than to get rid of clipping. Next tip before you start is to be aware of how and whether your room is impacting your sound. So this is the audio captured by the camera, and this is the audio captured by my audio interface. Obviously you should never use your camera's microphone, but that's not the point here. Neither is my point that you make sure that your room is fully treated before you start, but rather to say that your studio or room is changing your music in ways that you may not be aware of. I'll make a whole video about this in a few weeks. Meanwhile, it may make sense to record your performance with good headphones if you're not confident you're aware of the impact your room has on your music. Once you're ready to get started, the next tip is to set aside time in which you purposefully work with a goal of creating a finished performance, because the album isn't going to play itself. Screenwriters say that the biggest secret to writing is to sit down and write. So set aside at least a couple of uninterrupted hours where the intent is to build a jam or performance that could be a track candidate. To me, a jam session is probably like how a sculptor starts with a block of marble. It starts looking like nothing and looks pretty bad along the way, but if you work at it enough, there just might be a beautiful statue in there. Next tip, once you feel you've got something good, start recording. And even if you feel like you've nailed the perfect performance, record at least one more, for two reasons. First, it might get even better. And second, you might find it useful to grab the best bits from different jams and combine them into one track. Okay, the next two tips are exactly the opposite of each other, but I found both to be useful. The first is, if you're playing a multi-instrument setup, or your instrument has multiple outputs, record everything into as many individual tracks as possible. And even if you're playing just one instrument, apply the effects after recording into your DAW or whatever else it is you're recording into, and the reason for this is clear. It's much easier to edit a mix when each of its elements is separate. So for example, in this jam I recorded Siren separately, and Peak, No Coast, which makes it much easier to add effects later on, not to mention balance or EQ each component separately. That said, you might not have a multi-channel audio interface, and regardless, options are the enemy of getting things done, so the flip side tip is just record in stereo with the effects baked into the recording. Meaning, if you don't have a multi-track audio interface, or if setting one up will kill the energy of your jam, don't let that stop you. Recording the entire mix, including effects, into a single stereo track is better than just not recording at all. And aside from that, the best way to guarantee you won't end up endlessly remixing your track is not to give yourself that option at all, and instead work on getting your mix as right as possible in the performance stage. Of course, that's risky and you're opening yourself up to regrets, but since our goal is to ultimately get things done, having plenty of mixing options does nothing to help that. Yeah, your mix won't be perfect, but guess what? It'll be done there and then. The Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's was recently remixed again 50 years after it was made, and I hear that Ringo Starr's drums are much more present in this mix. But if I'm not mistaken, the original album did kind of okay too. A recorded jam with flaws is better than a session you missed out on because you didn't go through the effort of hooking everything up. Next little tip, assuming you're recording into a DAW, even if you're playing a hardware instrument, set up a MIDI track and record the MIDI notes played in addition to the audio. These notes can be used later on to add an additional layer of the same instrument or a completely different one. Like I did here, I took the notes from the synth lead, transposed them up, put them on a parallel piano track, took out a few notes here and there, and the result is that this piano line is the exact same notes as this synth line. Something that gave me the option to let this track evolve a little bit more. If you didn't record the MIDI notes coming out of your synth, a delay effect is a really nice way to add notes where they weren't there before. Again, all in the purpose of helping the track evolve, so this is automation curve number 1. Adding a delay is just like playing a few more notes in real time, only with a time machine. And then second automation curve is coming right up. Obviously you can apply other effects in post as well, but nothing is quite as good at adding additional notes as a tempo synced delay. Another way to cheat time and go back and edit a complete mix, which I didn't end up doing in this album, but you could if you wanted, is with software called Infinity from a company called Hitnmix. This software lets you edit an audio file or a complete mix as if it was simple notes on a piano roll. So I just moved the top note in a chord in a finished audio file. Now this software isn't perfect yet, it has some issues detecting tails. But if you've got something that really bothers you, you might be able to change it. For example, in this area, let's say that I wanted to change the timing of this note to make it a bit earlier. You could stretch it out. And it works quite nicely. Let's try this somewhere else. Maybe here, if I felt that note was a little bit late too, just stretch it back. And it's quite passable. Ultimately, I didn't end up using it though. The software doesn't yet work perfectly in stereo, and after moving notes around, I felt a bit like I should just move on and keep things as they are. Okay, let's move on to the last step before submitting your track or album to stores, and that's mastering. Now, I'm no mastering pro, but to me, mastering has two purposes. The first is a technical one, getting your tracks to the proper level. That also helps all the tracks in an album get to a similar level. And then the second goal of mastering, if you can, is to improve the tracks in the process. Now, for this project, working with YouTube meant that I had a budget to hire a professional mastering engineer, which I did. But before I move on to the professional manual process, that isn't a must, it's more of a luxury. I've mastered tracks for other projects using Ozone 9 from iZotope, which does an excellent job too. Let's just take a quick look at how it works. You can do everything manually, but I just prefer to go with a mastering assistant. Default settings seem good to me. And you pick an area of your track where it's the loudest. It does its AI thing. So the most important thing to me was to hit the right loudness target, but did it make it better? There's a nice tool here which lets you compare the track to what it was before. Now, just bypassing what Ozone did doesn't help much. Yeah, it got louder, that's okay, but did it get better? Luckily, there's a gain match feature, so this is the before. And this is the after. Before. It's subtle, but I think it's better. Let's see what it did. These are overall EQ changes. It didn't activate the compressor. Dynamic EQs. The maximizer. Now I could go ahead and mess with this as much as I wanted. There's a bunch of stuff here. Say, an exciter. You know, the question is, does it get better? Because you can ruin things too in mastering. Ultimately, I think what Ozone did here is pretty nice. So let's take a look at professional mastering. I initially went to 2 different engineers, sent them 3 trial tracks. Mastering is a process where you go back and forth a few times, so it's important to be able to work well with the person and of course like the results you receive. Ohad, who mastered my album, agreed to walk us through his process. Let's take a look.
Hi, I'm Ohad Nissim, a mixing and mastering engineer from Berlin. I also produce electronic music when I have some free time. Anything from dark techno to experimental electronics, I guess. I had the pleasure of mastering Ziv Loop album, which was really fun as a synth lover myself, and I even bought 2 new synths after the project was ready. Ziv asked if I mind sharing some of my process while mastering the album, and I was more than happy to contribute to his channel. So here's a quick show and tell of how I work and how I master the album. Okay, so we have the original file, and the process is from here, it goes to the master bus where I'm usually doing my processing. If it's plugins or hardware, we'll go through it in a second. Other than that, there's a parallel analog tape on the audio file, which returns right here. Right now I'm sending plus 6 dB to the tape, just to push it a bit more, to get that extra warmth and glue that I was looking for. And we'll have a listen to it. Yeah, it's not a lot, but it's enough. It just adds a nice layer of analog warmth. From there, both the clean track and the parallel tape going in through the master bus. I started with the Gulfus because the track was not, let's say, properly mixed. It was recorded in one take. So I just like to put the Gulfus for extra balance, also kind of gluing the tape and the main track together. It doesn't do a lot, but yeah, just clearing up a bit of the mid range, also from the tape. That also adds a bit of mud, and adding a bit of top end, some higher frequencies that were missing from the mix. From there I'm going into Dyne 1. Really great parallel compressor, very transparent, adds a beautiful way to anything actually. If you think your mix is thin, I would recommend using this. It's really great to make things fatter, let's say. Not pushing too much, ended up on -23. Again, it changes on every track. Yeah, let's have a listen. Yeah, it just pushes the whole mix more up front, adding some weight, basically. From there, I'm going into Chandler Bender, which is one of my favorite EQs. Kind of my color choice for this album, let's say. So I used it on every track on the album. It's very musical, and whatever you do with it, it always sounds good to my ears. So The main work here is the cut at 500 Hz, which removes a lot of the mud, and we can have a listen. Yeah, it just opens up the mix, makes more room for the synth to shine, removes mud. Yeah, I like it. From there, I'm going to the surgical EQ, which is BX Digital. As you can see, I'm removing a lot around low, mid-range frequencies. Just removing more mud, actually. Let's have a listen. Yeah, to me it's like removing a blanket from top of the mix. Instantly lose the thing that it just sits there, and now the synth is a lot clearer and you can hear, I think, every element in the track. From there, I felt like this track is a bit too mono, and there's no really bass line or anything or other instruments. So for me, I felt it was okay to spread it on the monitors. So I used NewGen Stereoizer for this. For me, it's at the moment 50-50 with this plugin. Sometimes it works amazingly, sometimes it just adds too much. So let's have a listen. Yeah, in this case, for me it works. It just adds this 3D kind of feel. From there, I go to my hardware chain, which is Apollo X16 going to Lavry Blueface, then an SPL tube vitalizer that doing almost nothing, just a tiny touch on the low end, compressing it a bit. And from there, it's going to the Phoenix Mastering Plus, which, as you can see on the video, barely moving, not even half a dB of gain reduction. But this machine is so deep. Once you remove it, it's like you're removing the death of the analog world, which everybody's looking for. So yeah, it's a great machine. From there, it's going to the Waves Max BCL, which not doing much. I'm just adding level to get closer to what I'm looking for in terms of level. And then it returns to the Lavry Blue and back to the Pro Tools, which then meets the Oxford Inflator for a bit more harmonic information. I'm only pushing 14%. Actually, before that, let's have a listen to the analog chain. Yeah, it's just dull. That's all I can say. Without it, of course. From there, harmonics with Oxford Inflator. Yeah, not doing a lot, but adding a bit more weight. And then it meets my current favorite limiter, which is the Vice, with a style of wide to make it a bit wider, of course. And there's barely gain reduction on this. I'm just pushing level again to reach where I wanted to be, which was around -13 LUFS, because the whole album is going to YouTube. Let's have a listen to the final product.
Okay, thanks very much to Ohad. I'll leave his contact info below. A couple of final things. If there's one thing that helped me finish this album, it's setting a deadline. There's no need to rush yourself, but once it's there, it really helps move things along as you break down the actions you need to take to meet that deadline. For example, a date by which you select the tracks, a date by which you finish the mix, and send to mastering, and so on. The last step is obviously uploading your music to streaming services so people can hear it. I used DistroKid just because they're easy to use, accessible, and distribute your music to pretty much every major service known to mankind, and this video isn't sponsored by them. I also like that you don't need to pay extra to upload more tracks, which is a really great incentive to get more of your music out there. So that's it for now. Hit like if this moved you ever so slightly towards releasing your own music. If these tips were useful, you'll find plenty more electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks in my book, available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Thanks very much for watching.